and welcome to today's webinar, Heat Pumps as Pillars as a Resilient Energy Future. I'm very happy to welcome you to this important topic. Heat pumps have been widely discussed during the last years, are a proven technology and really the most cost-effective one to decarbonize buildings. But deployment of clean technologies like heat pump must still accelerate significantly for climate goals, for energy security, and also for competitiveness reasons of the clean tech industry. So we're really glad to have international experts here today that will be offering technical guidance and for policymakers and how to achieve that, how to scale up those heat pump markets to deliver. And I'm very happy to welcome Louise Sunderland. She's Europe Director at RAP for the first presentation. So without further ado, hello, Louise, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. I will start my presentation. I'm Louise Sunderland. I'm the director in Europe for RAP, which is the Regulatory Assistance Project. We're a global clean energy transition research and policy advisory organisation. We're a not-for-profit. And in Europe, we work on across power, heat, transport, industrial decarbonisation. But here today, I am here to introduce you to the Global Heat Pump Toolkit. But before we go into the toolkit, we should answer the question, why heat pumps? Why is this not a clean heat toolkit? Why is this a heat pump toolkit? Why would we pick one technology when we know policymakers are generally quite averse to picking winners? They prefer technology neutral approaches. Well, heat pumps, of course, are responding to the global heating challenge, which we know is very significant. Around 50% of global final energy demand is for heating, and we know heating is delivered quite significantly through use of fossil fuels at the moment, as the picture is showing us on this graph, on this slide. But why heat pumps in response to that challenge? Well, heat pumps are the key clean technology to replace those fossil fuels because they're kind of magic. You know, they are highly, highly efficient. So heat pumps produce units of multiple units of heat from smaller numbers of electricity input, which makes them highly efficient, which means they use less energy overall than their fossil fuel comparators. This also makes them much cleaner than their fossil fuel comparators, pretty much in any grid generation situation. So they can also be much more cost effective and certainly will be in the future. So they produce heat, hot water and cooling from renewable sources. And they're a really flexible technology. I mean, I think we tend to sort of think about the heat pump technology in very individual uses, like in a single home, for example, but actually they can be used all the way from providing heat and cooling in an individual apartment, all the way through to providing heat as a part of a district heating system, or even for very, very large installations in industry, for example. And it's those credentials that I think have led to many, I think all of the global scenarios now seeing that heat pumps will be a key part of delivering against 2050 decarbonisation of heating targets. So just including two examples here on the left from the IEA, on the right from McKinsey, telling a very similar story. And in both graphs, we're looking at the turquoise part of the graphs. On the left, the IEA is looking at the global heating equipment stock, and you can see in 2030, but it's very significantly by 2050, the majority, or the larger part rather, of that stock is made up from heat pumps. McKinsey on the right is looking at sales, so rather than the stock, the sales. Similar story though, heat pumps are really, along with district heating there in 2050, making up all of the system sales. And once again, just to dwell on this point about cost effectiveness, largely because of this efficiency that heat pumps produce, they are seen to be the most cost-effective heating solution. If not today, and in many places they are already the most cost-effective heating solution, if not today, actually in the future. This is an interesting one of many actually analyses based from Europe that firmly sees heat pumps. You can see the once again the turquoise bars with the stars above them, firmly the most cost-effective solutions by 2030 and onwards. And I just want to stop and dwell here for a moment because this technology certainty is huge. When I started my career nearly 20 years ago now, working on the building sector decarbonisation, we didn't have this certainty. We didn't know what would be the majority solutions for decarbonising buildings. And so we couldn't build the policies with that much certainty. And we also couldn't build kind of broader building sector decarbonisation goals with that certainty. So this is huge. But, and there is a but, is that we need more policy attention. Deployment of heat pumps is not enough, is not where it should be to be meeting climate targets. We've seen rapid growth in lots of markets, so particularly the Nordics, in Europe, in China, in North America, but you can see there is this gap still here in the deployment rate from where we are in kind of the recent growth rate globally to where we need to be, which is the red line. So the gap is the big story from this chart. There's another story in this chart, actually, which is actually looking at the red line. You can see a much steeper incline to around the mid-2030s. So this is really telling us that actually this decade to come is absolutely vital. We need to ramp up heat pump markets globally, very, very significant. And actually, this is a very similar story to the chart that McKinsey was showing around sales as well. So the key messages here is that we need policy attention, and this is the vital decade. So in response, RAP, along with partners, including Class, GBPN, Agora, of course, with the support of the Crux Alliance, have come together and brought together their sort of decades-long global experience with heating technologies from the different sectors that they work in to then build this heat pump policy toolkit. This is a refreshed and expanded toolkit released just at the end of last year, and it compiles global best practices on policies and regulations associated with heat pump deployment. And I do believe it's the first and possibly only of its kind. And I'm going to kind of walk you through some of the elements of that heat pump policy toolkit. But before I do, I just want to tell you the story of one heat pump. And I do think that this story illustrates actually why we need to be looking at a policy toolkit, a policy framework, and not just prioritizing individual policies, because that would be easier, right? And this is the story actually of my heat pump. And so I can introduce you here to my heat pump installed a couple of years ago in the UK. And it's important to note that actually the UK is one of the least developed heat pump markets in Europe. So cut to the end of the story, we lived happily ever after. We are very happy with our heat pump. My home is very old, about 150 years old, and we are very happy in it. I always use the quote from my partner, who was brought up in a very warm country and is very, very cold sensitive. He says it feels like summer all year round, which is music to my ears. But what's perhaps more interesting is the process of how we arrived at this destination. And I think it tells us a lot about the need for policy packages. So first of all, we decided we were going to install a heat pump. I knew, because of the work I do, that my next heating installation would be a heat pump. And that's really important to dwell on because it already put me steps ahead of most other building owners because I had that knowledge, and it allowed me to then go straight to finding an installer. And this is the first question, the first challenge I approached, because it turns out in the area of London that I live, in southeast London, there aren't many heat pump installers, particularly, really well-trained heat pump installers. So I had to spread the net a little bit wider and actually found a heat pump installer in North London. Now, if you've spent any time in London or if you've visited London, you'll know that it's difficult to even get a taxi cab to travel from North London to South London. So it was a big ask to ask this installer to travel all that way to install my heat pump, but he did. And Wesley, his name is, he's absolutely fantastic, did an excellent job. In the process of deciding the practicalities about the install, we came upon a siting rule in the UK that says you can't put a heat pump right on a boundary. And in London, a lot of the housing is terrace housing. All the houses are squashed together. Pretty much all of our plot is boundary. So it's quite tricky to find a place where to put the heat pump. And this is why you can see in this picture the heat pump is high up on the wall. As we got in, we came across another a challenge or question around manufacturer capacity, and we had a bit of a delay of the arrival of the heat pump. I also had questions about who was going to be paying for and responsible for the removal of my gas meter. And that was just the practical questions aside from the questions about upfront cost. This heat pump install was around 3 times the cost of a comparable fossil fuel install, reduced to around 2 times with the subsidy that I was able to get from the government. And then running costs. The UK has very high electricity prices when you compare them to gas prices. It's quite an outlier, which is the good news. But despite the fact that this heat pump works brilliantly, thanks again to Wesley for the brilliant performance of around 400% efficiency. But despite that incredible efficiency, I'm probably not saving a huge amount of money because of this difference in pricing. So there's a lot of questions there, and I think it's really clear that there's no one policy that would have addressed every question, every potential barrier. And every question there or every potential barrier could have meant that this heat pump install didn't go ahead. The good news from the UK perspective is just in that short 2 years since I installed this heat pump, we have a number of very important developments in the UK market. So just this month, the introduction of a market mechanism that should really address the installer and manufacturer capacity issues, really aiming to scale up those supply chains. There's a consultation on removing that siting rule that would mean I could put this down on the floor, this heat pump down on the floor and not at first floor level. There's an increased subsidy, and perhaps actually more interestingly, new market entrants that are really driving down the costs of installs through efficiency and really tightening up those install processes. And then finally, promised action on those all-important energy prices. In addition to which, I think the other thing happening in the UK market that's super interesting at the moment is that we are having access to more flexible tariffs, which actually I'm experimenting with to then reduce my costs further. So I think that story illustrates that we do need this policy toolkit, we do need the policy framework to address each and every of the barriers. The other side of that story, though, is that when we introduce policies together, they become more than the sum of their parts. So the common example we see is perhaps a subsidy introduced alongside, for example, an efficiency standard, where the subsidy is really supporting the market to move towards much, much more efficient models. And I think you can see there that there are kind of co-benefits to those two being introduced. And so this is why RAP and all those partners that I listed really focused on the framework of policies. And this is the illustration of the framework that we came up with. We've used this sort of simple Greek temple where the pediment, the blue triangle at the top there, is the sustainable heat pump market. Supporting that market are these 3 pillars and the foundations. And I'll just go through very briefly those elements, but really importantly that it's all of those elements that need to work together to ensure successful deployment and to make sure the markets can grow sustainably. So starting then with the foundations, which are all about coordination and communication, I think sometimes quite overlooked in policy frameworks, but really, really vital. And so the communication elements here are really around public awareness for consumer confidence and trust. When we are making technology changes, this is really, really important. And this is the stuff really, that I benefited from in my work. But of course, if everyone could know, well, automatically my next heating system will be a heat pump. This is what these tools are there to create. Importantly as well, I think that it is about just-in-time information and just-in-time mechanisms. So to make sure that people, as I did, can plan for their installation, not start exploring a new technology like a heat pump when their old system is broken. And that's, I think, really, really important. It's also about installer training, certification schemes, so that everyone has access to a Wesley close to where their installation is, and they aren't having to sort of search across the country or across the region. And again, it's about the coordination to make sure that that heat pumps are being integrated where the grid capacity allows, and that we have utility integration. So on those foundations sit these 3 pillars, the first of which is the economic and market instruments. And this is where the all-important kind of energy pricing reform to make sure that electrification is always the most kind of affordable choice, because otherwise we're really asking people to to almost do the impossible. It's quite difficult to ask. So this is aligning electricity and fossil fuel prices with climate goals that might include things like carbon pricing. I think it's really important here to focus as well. The aim here is affordability. It is definitely cost effectiveness, but I think the overarching aim of all of these policies is these economic or financial policies is towards affordability. And affordability means different things for different types of households. So yes, cost effectiveness is an aim, but I think we need to be pushing forward to actually make sure that the supports are there for every household to be able to take up the offers. And again, I think importantly in there to make sure that the markets can value the bucket loads of demand side flexibility that heat pumps, big fleet of heat pumps can offer, to make sure the markets can value that. So then we as heat pump owners can then allow our or schedule our systems to be operating in service of the grid, in service of bringing down costs for everyone and getting the value through lower prices for ourselves. I think that's really important. The second pillar is financial support. This is the grants and rebates. I talked about the UK subsidy actually increasing after I received my heat pump. And I think in a market like the UK where, heat pump installs are still pretty low, we don't have a well-developed market, I think subsidies are having a really key role. But I do think increasingly every heat pump install cannot rely on a subsidy. We know that. We don't have the public funds. So we need increasingly to be thinking about where the public funds are most importantly deployed, where no other tool, financial mechanism will serve. And I do think that's increasingly for lower income households. And then some kind of financial engineering with loans and finance offerings combined with subsidies for other households. I'm particularly keen on the heat as a service model because I think that the heat as a service model can combine elements of subsidy, elements of some financing, can take responsibility for ensuring maintenance and good operational performance, as well as also operating, as I said, fleets of heat pumps as an aggregator to provide system flexibility services. I think it's a lovely end-to-end model. And then finally, the third pillar is these regulatory policies. And so common ones, of course, are building codes. We're quite familiar with building codes, particularly driving fossil fuels out of new builds, but also efficiency standards for products, efficiency standards for systems through building codes can then obviously help to increase the uptake of heat pumps in existing buildings, as can fossil fuel phase outs. And so we've seen fossil fuel heating phase outs that either focus on the replacement of technologies or that focus on use of the fuels. We've seen those be quite effective for example, oil boiler or the use of oil fuels phase outs in Europe. I think a different approach, and I think a very useful approach, and one we should perhaps be working on a little bit more, is an area-based approach. So looking at how zoning, maybe through heat planning or urban planning, or in fact through gas grid decommissioning plans, can be used to provide some clarity for people about when it's time to move to a heat pump from a fossil fuel system. And I think that last point really links in these regulatory policies right back to the communication, because I do think that these regulatory policies are really important as much as regulations, but actually it's communication tools. I think that's a real value there, is that regulations provide real clarity to building owners about what their building needs to do on a decarbonisation kind of trajectory. So that's the overview of the policy types in the toolkit. We go in the toolkit in quite some depth to successful studies on the different policies and their impacts. I'm not going to go through all these examples, but as a flag that they're there. We have deep dives on the policies where they exist, and importantly on which jurisdictions are bringing together lots and lists of the different policy elements in that framework that I've described. So we can look to countries that perhaps have gone a one step ahead or have maybe developed their policy frameworks a little earlier. So the toolkit is available at this QR code. It's also accompanied with a accessible video series for different users, and welcome you to go down, have a look, and download the resources. And I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Louise, for that personal insight and also this overview for the toolkit. I'll now hand over to my colleague Stefan Verheyen. He's Project Officer Climate Neutral Buildings at Agora, and he'll give us some more insights from a European point of view and also relating to energy security. The floor is yours, Stefan.
Thanks, Uta, and thanks, Luis, for your presentation. Yes, after Luis just introduced the toolkit of heat pump policies and what policy framework can do to support the uptake of heat pumps, I'm going to look a bit more specifically on the European Union, also with the current political background of a stronger focus on energy security. And yeah, after short state of play kind of market overview, I will also look to the EU policy landscape and also refer to some of the work we as Agora did on potential new EU policies to boost the uptake of heat pumps. But first, let's take a brief look at the EU heating market and what energy sources European households are using for space and water heating. On the left side, you can see the energy mix for heating here, both in Europe and in 8 member states. And as you can see, to briefly sum it up, that fossil fuels are still very much dominating residential heating in Europe. More than half of Europe's residential heating is provided by fossil fuels, even more in some member states like Italy or the Netherlands. And when you take a bit of a closer look on which fossil fuels are important, then you can see that it's especially fossil gas, which is really a very important heating fuel in nearly all member states. And yeah, that is also underlined by the chart we can see on the right side, looking at the overall fossil gas consumption in the European Union. And you can actually see there that nearly half of the EU's gas consumption can be related either to the residential heating, so to gas boilers in individual homes, or to district heating. So this underlines that, fossil gas plays a very important role in the EU residential heating. And on the other way around, also residential heating is a very large factor in the EU's fossil gas demand. And this, of course, brings us to the topic of energy security, because as you all probably know, the EU is very much dependent on fossil gas imports, only has a very small production of fossil gas. And it's interesting to put this into a global perspective, because here, in this chart, you can see kind of the trade balance of different major economies with regards to fossil gas. And you can see that the EU is by far the largest net importer of fossil gas. So actually, this gas dependency in the residential heating sector is also an energy security issue for the European Union, because the European Union strongly depends on gas imports and has a kind of strategic interest to decarbonize in this way, to become less dependent on fossil gas imports. And this link could also be clearly seen during the 2022 energy crisis, and this link can also be clearly seen in the historical data on the heat pump uptake. So you can see here the heat pump sales numbers in the European Union between 2014 and 2022. And you can see that there was a continuous slight uptake in these years, and then there was a very sharp increase in the year 2022. So just during the 2022 energy crisis, heat pump deployment in Europe increased because of the energy crisis, because of the aim of reducing fossil gas imports, especially from Russia. So there's a very strong link between heat pump deployment and energy security for the European Union. Unfortunately, this trend didn't follow in the coming years, and the heat pump deployment actually declined quite drastically last year. And now heat pump deployment in Europe is back to the level of 2021, so to pre-energy crisis levels. So although the energy crisis drove the deployment of heat pumps in 2022, we're now in a situation where we're kind of back, although back to pre-crisis levels, although of course the European Union still has a very strong dependency on foreign fossil gas imports. So when you want to explain these trends, There are, of course, some time trends in the course of with regards to the energy markets. Gas prices have decreased again, so it has become less attractive for households to install a heat pump compared to a gas boiler. But there are also some more structural barriers we have identified for heat pumps to become the main solution for heating appliances in Europe. And the first major barrier here is, as Luis already mentioned, related to the upfront costs of installing a heat pump. In this overview here, you can see the upfront costs of installing a heat pump compared to a gas boiler in 5 different European markets: Germany, Italy, France, Poland, and the Netherlands. And you can see that in all of these countries, although the overall price level is quite different between these countries, there's a very large gap between heat pumps and gas boilers, meaning that for many households, it's just financially the most attractive solution in the first place to install a gas boiler. Of course, this only takes into account the upfront costs and not the running costs, so not the costs over the whole lifetime, where heat pumps are more efficient. But if you only look to the upfront costs, then for many households, especially for low-income households, it's still very difficult to afford a heat pump. And this is a key barrier for heat pump deployment. And then this goes hand in hand with another key barrier already mentioned by Luis, which are energy prices. Here you can actually see that member states differ quite a lot in terms of the relation between electricity and gas prices. As you can see here in this overview, there's a strong difference between, for example, Belgium on the one side, where electricity prices are nearly 4 times the level of the gas price, and the Netherlands, where it's only 1.5 times the gas price. So this is, of course, a very influential factor for the affordability, but also the attractiveness of buying a heat pump. And also here, it's in many member states, due to a high electricity to gas price ratio, it's currently financially not very attractive to install a heat pump. A third market barrier then relates to the shortage of installers and the availability of heat pump installers. Also here you can see for 6 major European countries that the number of gas boiler installers is way higher than the number of heat pump installers. So for a household which is trying to replace its heating system, it's sometimes difficult to find a heat pump installer and more easy to find a gas boiler installer. So this also then results in the fact that gas boilers are still a very convenient choice for many households to install, while finding a heat pump installer, especially in some countries, is more difficult and takes more time. So these are kind of the 3 fundamental market barriers. And now, as Luis already mentioned, there's a lot what countries have already done to address these barriers, especially the economic ones. In Europe, we can see several policies which have been put in place to reduce upfront costs of heat pump for households. We can see on the right an overview of different of the subsidy level for installing a heat pump in different member states. We can see that this is quite a relevant reduction of upfront costs. And all of these 5 member states, you can see that for some households, for example, in France or Germany, it could be up to nearly 2/3 of the upfront costs, which is financed by the government. And so a really significant reduction here through government support. In some member states, you also have a reduction of VAT for heat pumps, or certain schemes for zero or low interest homes, low interest loans, which help households to finance a heat pump investment. So a lot of policies, a lot of resources which have been mobilized by governments to reduce upfront costs for a heat pump. And then there are also increasingly policies for rebalancing the energy prices in favor of electricity. The most important one will come into force in 2027, which will be the ETS2, so the expansion of the European emission trading system to heating fuels. So Europe will have a unified carbon price on heating fuels, which will then increase fossil fuel prices and therefore relatively make electricity more attractive. Other measures which we could observe were, for example, the rebalancing of energy taxation in some member states, or certain incentives for installing rooftop PV and consuming this electricity on site. So that's the incentive side. Then on the regulatory side, you can also observe that there have been several policies put in place in Europe, both on the European and the national level, especially with regards to new builds, as already mentioned by Louise. Several member states have introduced requirements for new buildings, which restrict the installation of fossil fuel boilers. In Europe, we will have zero emission buildings, the obligation in the European Energy Performance of Buildings Directive from 2030, which will require all new buildings to not have fossil fuel boilers. We could see several of these requirements already in certain member states, such as France, or for example, also the Netherlands, where gas connections for new buildings are not allowed anymore. Then we could also see several policies regarding energy infrastructure. So, for example, on the European level, member states are obliged now to create local heating and cooling plans. Member states need to assess the future of their respective gas grids. There's mandatory municipal heat planning in Germany. There's even in Denmark, it's even planned to entirely phase out the supply of fossil gas to buildings until 2035. So also here, some policies have been taken, but, and that's a big but, if we look to existing buildings and if we look to the European level and also to key member states, not a lot has been introduced with regards to the installation of fossil fuel boilers in existing buildings. Here we only have a requirement from the European level to reduce the energy consumption until 2030 by 16%. But member states are kind of flexible in how they implement this requirement. So far, we only have a regulation in Germany, which will require all heating installation from in existing buildings to meet a share of renewable energy of 65% from 2026 or 2028. This still needs to be revised under the incoming government, so it currently remains uncertain what will come out of it. But for now, there is this provision. In other member states, plans for these legislation, however, it didn't come through. And also at the European level, there were plans to introduce stricter efficiency standards for heating appliances, which in the end, however, were refused politically. So with this regulatory uncertainty, you can see when you look to market forecasts that there's still a lot of uncertainty also for the heating market, and actually for which technologies will prevail in the 2030s. And this results in the current policy uncertainty results in forecasts still showing a major role for the installation of new fossil fuel boilers. So here in this figure, you can see that the projected share of heat pumps in the heating market is going to increase due to the different support policies put in place, both on the European and the national level. But there's still a very significant share of new fossil boiler installations in this market forecast for the 2030s, which is, of course, a huge liability for the EU in both terms, both for its climate ambition, but also for its energy security objectives. If we take a bit of a closer look now on what would be needed to scale the deployment of heat pumps even further, we can see that it's not only one policy, as mentioned by Louise before, but several policies which are needed to make a heat pump attractive. In this chart, we can see the carbon price, which would be needed to make a heat pump investment attractive for households in 10 years, over a lifetime of 10 years in different member states. And we can see on the left side that with current electricity prices, a relatively high carbon price would still be needed, even though in some cases, even with a grant of 30%, this would still be a quite considerable carbon price, at least in some member states like Germany or Czechia. But then for reduced electricity price, so for reduced electricity taxation, this carbon price would be significantly lower. And this again then also points out that it's not only one policy measures such as carbon price, but different policy measures such as carbon pricing, grants, but also rebalancing of energy taxation, which are actually needed for households to make heat pump attractive. And now, lastly, we will look to what we propose actually for a new EU heating policy and what relates to these different challenges which were just mentioned, such as political difficulties to introduce regulation on fossil fuel boiler installations in existing buildings. And we will look a bit closer to a policy which has been already mentioned by Louise, the so-called UK Clean Heat Market Mechanism, which is an obligation on heating manufacturers in the United Kingdom to increase the share of heat pumps in their sales portfolio over time. You can see here in this graph the ambition level for this instrument. And this obligation works in a way that manufacturers are required to meet this target every year, and this target is increasing over time. And in case manufacturers miss this target, actually they have to pay a fine, or they have to participate in a credit trading mechanism where they have to basically buy a credit from a competitor which has achieved its target. So in the end, it's providing the manufacturer with an incentive to boost their heat pump sales and to make heat pumps more attractive for consumers. And interestingly, this policy was introduced the beginning of this month. And what you could already see is that due to this incentive for manufacturers to actually make heat pumps more attractive for consumers, they, for example, started to offer rebates to them to achieve their target. And so we thought that this could be an interesting policy as well for the European Union. And we have come up with a proposal of a so-called EU Clean Heat Market Instrument. Yes, I'm going to spare you a bit the details, but basically it would be a similar policy instrument at the European level, where manufacturers would need to first report their sales. Then they would be benchmarked based on their sales performance, and in the end they would also have a type of a charge or fine, which would incentivize them financially to sell more heat pumps and to make them more attractive. And that's a very, very important distinction from traditional policy instruments such as grants, where the incentive is basically directly given for the consumer. But here under this policy, it would be an incentive to market actors. So market actors would be actually motivated to reduce prices for heat pumps and make heat pumps more accessible. For example, also through a streamlined installation process. So regarding the three most important points of this instrument, first, as already mentioned, the instrument would activate market actors to make clean heating more accessible, both through decreasing prices and providing more technical support. We also see this policy potentially as a policy signaling governments a dedication to clean heating goal. And also we see this policy increasing the effectiveness of carbon pricing, because this instrument would provide an economic incentive not only on the heating fuels, such as the carbon price, but also on the heating appliance itself. So another economic incentive for consumers to switch to clean heating. And with this, I am closing just with a slide to briefly show that, this is part of the balanced policy mix, of course, and such an instrument should not be seen as a silver bullet, or when mentioned before, but as part of a policy mix which can make clean heating more attractive and competitive. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Stefan, for these insights. And I see that these different policies really address everyone, or many actors along the chain. I would like to open our panel discussion now and welcome our panelists. Joining us from the US is Vivian Cox. She's a senior associate and climate policy analyst at CLASP, and she's an HVAC and refrigeration appliance standards expert. Vivian, great to have you here. And let me also welcome Chiara Del Mastro. She is an energy analyst for buildings at the International Energy Agency, an expert on heat pumps, and you're also a modeler. Welcome, Chiara. And of course, we have Stefan and Louise still with us. So welcome everybody to the panel. And I'd like to take a look at how the market status is actually for heat pumps, because we have had these ups and downs. And Chiara, you're an expert on that. 2024 was not what we'd call a really easy year for heat pumps, but we may see a turning point in some regions. What's your take on that, Chiara?
Yes, thanks for the questions and good afternoon also everyone. And indeed, 2024 was a particular year for heat pumps. We saw that global heat pump sales dropped just 1%. And this showed more stability compared to 2023, which instead show sharper drop of 3%. But we do track heat pump market quite closely, and I said it was particular because we observed that sales were down 10% in the first half of 2024. And this means that there has been a strong recovery in the market in the second half of the year. Why is that? Where it happened? So two key regions drive the recovery. The first is Japan, and second is the United States. In Japan, we saw a 5% increase in heat pump sales, both air-to-air and also the air-to-water segments. And this was helped both by the subsidies, but also by more disposable income of households. And instead, when we look at the US, we did see increase in sales of about 15% overall, but over 30% in the second half of the year. And this, we think, is also due to the greater hit of some incentives and the local programs. But then I said sales were down 1%. Why was that? So first is China. China is the largest global market for heat pumps, and this year stayed flat. And the second reason, as we all saw in the previous presentation, was about Europe. 21% decline, many reasons that we heard before, and especially driven by some key markets in Europe, like Germany, minus 50%, France, minus 25%. But there has also been countries with an increase. So, for example, Austria and the UK. So overall, what's the take? Maybe more broadly, we did observe that was not just heat pumps to decrease, was the whole heating equipment market in general. So also fossil fuels systems did decrease over 2024. And of course, the heat pump market suffered, but also the systems keeps decarbonizing according to our data. So emissions last year fell 2%. And we've also seen in this presentation of a toolkit and also the other presentations that there are several policy opportunities, several examples of best practices, maybe not fully replicable from one countries to another, but still we can learn and share these experiences. And in parallel, also there are several innovations in the heat pump market, which are progressing fast. For instance, to enhance flexibility, to operate in colder climates, switch refrigerants, enhancing efficiency and acoustics. So there are reasons to stay positive in our opinion.
So thank you, Chiara. So we're not there yet, but some positive signs. And Vivian, we heard from Chiara, programs working well in the US. What are your findings on policies and programs in the US?
This is a great question, honestly, Uda. So to start, I'll just share some brief background and context for the current state of the US heat pump market. As Chiara mentioned, over the past several years, heat pumps in the US have been slowly and relatively steadily increasing sales. There was an exception with a significant drop in 2023, which I believe was similarly seen in Europe, late 2023, early 2024. So overall, though, the market share for heat pumps in the US has slowly increased. And since 2021, heat pumps have outsold furnaces by about roughly 20 to 30%. So again, Chiara mentioned the increased incentives in the US, helping to kind of kickstart some more rapid heat pump adoption. In an effort to continue this progress in 2022, the US saw some significant federal level action by the Biden administration with the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. This act designated nearly $400 billion just toward a wide range of climate-related programs and objectives. So the IRA did include funding that states could individually apply for that would fund consumer incentives for electrification, home improvements, and a lot of this included heat pumps. So the funding did seem to be helpful to states that already had programs and incentives in place, but ultimately isn't enough to independently move the needle more than a few percentage points as far as heat pump adoption increases are concerned. It sounds like a lot of money, but you divide by 50 states and then by how many consumers and households you want to adopt heat pumps, and it gets watered down pretty quickly. So consequently, we have seen in the US an uptick at the state level in the adoption of policies, especially including hybrid heat and clean heat standards, which are have been pretty useful in supporting heat pump adoption and other climate objectives. So we've also seen an increase in local and state incentives. RAP and CLASP actually recently co-hosted a webinar where we were able to hear about how states and cities are increasingly joining forces and pooling resources to support effective incentive programs. And this seems to be working well. I'll wrap up with I think my bottom line observation is that in the US, state action is currently where we are most likely to see positive developments for policies that benefit heat pump adoption for the time being. So we're not anticipating to see much federal action at this point. So thank you, Uda.
So thank you very much, Vivian. Sorry. So very important work done at the state level. Louise, I was wondering, when we look at where those heat pump manufacturers come from, like from different continents, and they've got very different potentials for economies of scale. What's your take on that? Isn't that like kind of an industrial policy aspect to that as well? And how should governments work with that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think it's really clear that I think many, if not most governments, are recognizing that kind of broader sector of clean tech as an important industrial growth area, and heat pumps are obviously in there. And I do think in today's political climate, particularly I think across sort of EU and US, we are seeing competitiveness, industrial competitiveness, on the downside, that agenda has the potential, it's very dominant, has the potential to kind of crowd out climate and environmental agendas. On the other hand, I do think that, the clean tech industry, which has, a lot of growth potential, a lot of future, can really kind of benefit and can feed into that kind of competitiveness agenda. So I think there are lots of opportunities to work with the kind of competitiveness, industrial competitiveness and competitiveness agendas, but they're not the only ones. I do think, obviously national situations and national drivers to build industrial strengths are many and varied. I mean, heat pump manufacturing could, for example, be responding to other goals such as economic transition of coal and carbon intensive regions, where we need to kind of create jobs and industrial and manufacturing capacity in dirtier sectors are declining, or in fact to build another national strengths like kind of R&D dominance. Chiara described some of the new kind of technical advancements that are being made in heat pump technology and the related technologies. So there's a lot of potentials there, but I think the kind of the headline from the policy perspective is that none of those factories, none of that manufacturing capacity gets built without certainty. You know, these are long-term plans and big investments. And I do think it's the regulatory framework that can provide a lot of that long-term certainty. So it's at the top level, it's the targets, but then it's really the delivery beneath that. It's getting the economics right, but it really is the regulations as well. I mean, there is nothing like a firm regulation that you can literally go from, well, this regulation is going to require X, Y, and Z to happen. You can very easily work out the numbers of what that market's going to look like and very easily make that into an investment plan and as an industrial manufacturing capacity. So there's nothing, I think, that's as sure as that.
So I understand a firm regulation also gives you much more certainty on the demand and really helps with investments. Stefan, you're working on the EU, and well, the European Commission has also looked at who's actually producing and offering these heat pumps, and they've identified heat pumps as a critical technology and their Net Zero Industry Act. What does that mean exactly for Europe?
At first, it means that heat pumps are a critical technology for Europe, which we probably all know, but is now also legally confirmed. So yes, this Net Zero Industry Act has been about identifying critical clean technologies for Europe's energy future. And yeah, it sets a target of 40% of domestic production for Europe, which is by now far exceeded by heat pumps. So I think around 80% of Europe's heat pumps are also produced in Europe. Yeah, so in general, it's of course good. It signals a commitment to the sector, not only from a demand perspective, but also from an industrial perspective. But as already said, I think the most important industrial policy for heat pumps in Europe is growing demand, because that's actually what manufacturers are missing right now and what they need to have investment certainty. So all this Net Zero Industry Act is very helpful for framing, and it's also very helpful to support manufacturers with some technicalities. But in the end, what matters is demand and building up demand. And there other policies are needed to grow the European heat pump market.
Thank you, Stefan. So demand and actually getting those heat pumps out there and reducing the emissions. That's why we started in the first place. Also, Chiara, you've worked a lot on modeling, and the IEA sees heat pumps as central to decarbonization. Where do we stand now compared to IEA scenarios on heat pumps?
Yes, so certainly heat pumps are key for its decarbonization, and we do see this in all our scenarios. But in our most ambitious scenario, we do see heat pumps to become really the dominant heating technology globally by 2050, and already by 2035 covering over 25% of space heating needs compared to about 10-12% today. But beyond this, we do also see some natural drivers for heat pumps uptake. So even when we look at our scenarios that is based on stated policies, we do see heat pump sales more than doubling by 2035 compared to last year levels. So of course there are uncertainties on hitting one scenario or another, and many countries do have regulations, do have targets, but I can just repeat what was said before, that success really depends on national policy implementation. And on the supply side, on the manufacturing side, I think we've demonstrated that the industry is ready to scale up. It's been proven during the after COVID period, 2020 to 2022. In Europe also there has been some very uncommon announcements about scaling up manufacturing production for heat pumps. So again, to be repetitive, but the key is really boosting demand. And we think there is a potential for that. So for instance, in Europe, 2024 has been tough, but there is a strong R&D leadership on large-scale heat pumps, hydrocarbon refrigerants. There is a clear regulation and targets for energy efficiency in buildings. If we look at China, which is the largest global markets, just a couple of weeks ago, there has been an action plan released about heat pumps, and this action plans links heat pumps growth to the dual carbon goals, and introduces targets to 2030. So what is really key is to build trust in the technology, ensuring that policies are stable, and also making heat pumps more affordable, in our opinion, especially for low-income households.
Thank you so much, Chiara. So it's really like, let's boost this demand. Louise, if you could like choose just a very few policies, what are like key policy requirements?
Yeah, I mean, I'm having presented the need for an entire framework, I'm probably going to.
But it's just like, okay, we're all, well, we need the whole framework. But how can we get going like this? I think, see, like Chiara has explained, there are many hopeful things. There's something here, there's something there. There's like, but what's really key? What's the thing like governments can't miss?
Yeah, I think if I could pick a couple of things, it's got to be the certainty and affordability hand in hand. I mean, we talked a lot. I mean, all of the previous answers really have been about kind of demand drive, providing a lot of that certainty. And so I think, but demand sort of doesn't, you know, a whole population of building owners doesn't suddenly look at each other and go, well, it's time to get a heat pump. You know, that kind of comes from somewhere. And so I think creating that certainty, and that can be done, as I sort of said, either through regulatory tools. I do think regulatory tools are much more communication tools than they are regulations, you know, big sticks, or the communication tools, and I think probably both. So I think the certainty is absolutely vital for each and every building owner to know what and when I change my heat pump, my heating system next, what's it going to be? Am I in an area for district heating, or am I going to need to have this heat pump now? I can plan for that. And then the affordability, of course, is vital. The other thing that I think we haven't touched on so much yet, but I do think is really clouding things at the moment, is we, certainly in Europe, we don't have clarity about the future of gas. We don't have, you know, this absolute clarity that this is not a fuel that will continue. I think there's been a lot of actually quite active efforts to avoid that clarity, that gas cannot continue to heat our homes and our buildings. So I think having that clarity, particularly at the regulatory level, so to having these kind of net zero mandates that allow regulators that regulate, that oversee infrastructure investment, infrastructure operation, and infrastructure maintenance, allowing them to have the clarity that actually we do need to see the gas system being phased out and there will be an end. I think that would be a really useful start as well.
Yeah, thanks for the reminder for all of us, Louise, that fossil gas and net zero do not really go hand in hand. And I think that's very important for homeowners as well. So we need that clarity. I've heard the term affordability. Like you said that, Chiara said that, and I know this is absolutely key. Vivian, and I think you've heard the term inflation quite often in the last year. But you've also done international work. Have you identified practices that maybe, especially on affordability, what can you tell us? What's particularly effective?
Thanks, Uda. So in the US, at the state level, I mentioned previously, clean heat standards and hybrid heat policies seem to be the best understood and most widely popular methods for supporting heat pump adoption, while also working towards other goals like reduced fossil fuel reliance and increased renewable energy generation, decreased greenhouse gas emissions. So I'll also note that in supporting our Europe team with heat pump focused work, CLASP found that one German policy was particularly worth noting and may be replicable elsewhere. For those that may not be aware, Germany offers incentives for heat pumps, but also offers an additional 5% incentive on top of this for choosing low GWP or natural refrigerants in heat pump systems. So Louise touched on a little bit of kind of what I'll wrap up my thoughts with, but on a general note, I'll also state that the bottom line, most effective way to increase heat pump adoption that we came across is to increase MEPs above 100% efficiency, even if effective dates are pushed out several years from now. We do recognize that in many instances, a MEPs of over 100% efficiency would likely be met with strong resistance from various industry sectors, or just may not be feasible. But this approach would effectively eliminate gas and electric resistance appliances from the market, pushing the market towards heat pumps. So this would also kind of address the issue that Louise mentioned with creating really clear policy signals to all sides of the market, including equipment manufacturers, installers, home builders, buyers, sellers, among others. So we've consistently also heard that a missing piece to making real progress on heat pump adoption is stability and a clear signal. And I think that really strong maps can be one of the, even if they're looking long term, not effective for several years, can be one of the best instruments to bring about that reassurance.
So you're really recommending minimum energy performance standards, appliance standards. Like Stefan, you had a slide on that that had quite some backlash in Europe, actually. Stefan, you see an important leverage, I guess, for heat pump policies at the producers level. Why do you see that?
I think throughout the project we did last year, we have really identified manufacturers to be the key actors to bring down costs for heat pumps, upfront costs. There are several factors, of course, and manufacturers are not the only actors here. But what we've seen so far is that in many European countries, as already shown before, we have a lot of subsidies, which are already reducing the price by quite a lot for households. But in the end, so far, we didn't really have an incentive for market actors to bring down costs. So what happened in some member states was that governments were very generously supporting the heat pump uptake, but in the end also increasing heat pump prices, which was then in some part countering the effect which was intended by the government. So we think that manufacturers are a key player to bring down prices, mostly also because they are responsible for the reskilling of installers. So they can ramp up the reskilling of installers, they can streamline distribution process to make it more easy to get a heat pump, and it doesn't take too long to find a heat pump installer. And therefore we think, yeah, they're the key actors to reduce the price in the long term.
Thank you, Stefan. Usually I'd say, like, doesn't competition reduce prices? Why is it that we don't have this kind of competition in our heat pump markets? I don't know who wants to, Chiara or Louise, can you give us an answer to that? And what would be a good measure for better affordability?
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I can just share a few thoughts on the affordability. On one end, it's true, but maybe there is not too much competition. But on the other end, we also see that, for instance, heat pumps are not much traded at the moment. So that's also something that, means that heat pumps are produced mostly locally. So it really depends on how the local markets builds up the competitiveness of the technologies. And for when we think of affordability, there are really two aspects. One is the capex and one is the opex. So the costs upfront and the cost during operation. So on the capital costs, now we see a premium, typically from heat pumps to some other alternatives at the moment. But we also do see that there are several subsidies in place or measures to compensate for this gap. So one area where really can raise affordability is about the OPEX. So making sure that the efficiency gains that heat pumps bring then are reflected in consumers' energy bills. And this depends on two main aspects. In our opinion, one is the electricity price, so electricity to gas price ratio that was mentioned also in Stefan presentation there. And the second is also the efficiency around the installation of heat pumps. So again, going back at the installers, making sure that this heat pump is properly designed for the buildings, properly installed and operated. And this also links, to the tariffs that are in place that I think Louise mentioned before. So if you have flexible tariffs or time of use tariffs, this can increase the overall affordability of the technologies, at least over the life cycle.
Thank you, Chiara. So really, really, your point is also the systemic view. It's not only the heating side, it is also the whole electricity system and how prices are made and how we use flexibility. Louise, your point on affordability.
Yeah, just to really agree with all that, and actually really agree with you to your last point there, which is, we do need to work as hard as possible on looking at every element that makes up the electricity price and figure out, where I mean, I honestly think there's probably very few savings to be made. So, when we're thinking about, we talk a lot about kind of changes to taxation, the tax elements of the bill, changes to the policy costs that are placed on bills. These are all costs that, need to be paid for somewhere. I think in some electricity bills in some countries, there are sort of non-energy related costs there that maybe should have been kind of covered by general taxation. So there are opportunities to perhaps move costs out of electricity bills. And certainly in RAP, we're working at the moment on thinking about how we would slightly rebalance taxes and levies and how to relieve that burden. But I don't think there's a single silver bullet. I do think we need to be looking at kind of every element of the bill, from the wholesale to the network. We know network costs or investment in network are probably going to go up, so that's moving in the other direction, possibly increasing prices, the tax elements and the further policy costs. So we need to look at all of that. But I think I really agree with Chiara as well. From the examples we've seen and for the models we've seen where countries like the UK are really trying to tackle that, and lots of civil society and research organisations trying to come up with proposals, even sort of trying to address what we can within the bill itself is probably not the silver bullet. So I do think we need to be looking at things like dynamic tariffs, looking at how we can use our buildings and our new technologies, our heat pumps, for sort of secondary uses, really, maybe even tertiary uses, right? Because when you think about the kind of amount of money that might get spent on electricity storage across Europe, and then you look at the building stock, and actually a reasonably insulated building stock is the biggest short-term electrified heat storage capacity we have, and it's already there. So actually thinking about kind of covering peak demand, for example, with being able to turn a whole bunch of heat pumps down a little bit to reduce that peak. Largely the building stock, even my house, which is really old, I have done some insulation to it, but it more than happily covers, keeps me warm if I turn down my heating during the peak, even on quite a cold day. So this just illustrates, I think, that we can be using these assets that we already have out there. Other assets are, the electric heating we have with direct electric heating, the water storage tanks that we have for our domestic hot water. There's a lot of assets out there that we could be using, I think, already, and we need to get access to those value offerings. There might be tariffs, there might be aggregated value offerings to help us to make those assets available and then get the value from them. So it's not a simple answer, but I really agree. Affordability and the operational cost focus is absolutely key, and we need to kind of pull out all the stops and think of all the solutions to contribute to that.
So true, and thanks for reminding us for that. I'd like to open the discussion now for the Q&A. And Stefan, following your presentation, we've had quite a bit of questions. Why heat pumps in Germany are so expensive? Can you explain that, please?
Yes, I can explain. Yeah, it was a quite shocking finding for us as well that the heat pump prices in Germany are around double the ones in France. I think there are several factors contributing to this sharp gap. First one, which has been often mentioned by manufacturers, is simply that Germany is a higher quality market. So customers have, as you would expect from Germans, stereotypically a higher demand for high quality installations, and therefore, of course, also which result in higher costs. But we've also seen that there have been other factors contributing to this. For example, a shortage of installers, which in the end drives up prices because installers have more market powers, and also a subsidy scheme in Germany, which is related to the share of the costs and not to an absolute amount as in other countries where governments provide a fixed amount per heat pump installation. In Germany, 30 to 70%. So this is, of course, also driving up the costs in the end and contributes to increasing heat pump prices. So I think there are several factors which can explain this gap.
Okay, so thank you, Stefan. I guess there's still some work to do on that. There's another question, which is more cost effective, individual heat pumps or rather going through district heating systems? And which one do you think will be dominant in the future? Louise, is that one for you?
Yeah, I can have a go at it. It's a big question, isn't it? With lots of layers. So I'll try not to give too complete an answer. I think which one will be more cost effective is a really good question. But I think that maybe the question before that is physically which solutions are suitable. So I think we know that district heating systems are very valuable where there's quite a high density, for example, of housing. Individual heat pumps, per unit in a multifamily building, for example, might not be as efficient a solution as having either a building level, so a communal heating system, or in fact connecting to a district. So I think there are, in terms of which solution we choose, often it's much more about kind of, the physicality of the area, what the different kind of heat demand load profiles look like, if there's sort of schools and leisure centres alongside to match that. But then thinking about the affordability, actually, I think there are some real benefits to heat pumps through district heating, not least some of the things that I was talking about before. There's a lot of heat storage potential in district heating system, purely because of quite a lot of volume of hot water flowing around. So I think that you can get efficiencies and certainly sort of price efficiencies through offering, the flexibility potential. Heat pumps in district heating systems can also be combined with other resources like PV, for example. So you can kind of get a really optimal combination of technologies which can make that really cost effective and affordable as well. So I think district heating has a lot of potential because as I say, the technical and sort of physical benefits. Thinking about cost there, actually, there is another layer, of course, which is governance and ownership structures, and we've done some really interesting work in a colleague of mine in RAP looking at that, actually, and looking at some of the cost to the participant, to the people connected to the district heating system, is actually dependent, I think, a lot on who's owning that system, how it's governed, and what are the kind of, because obviously as a natural monopoly, you don't have a lot of choice. If you've got a district heating system that you're connected to, you kind of take the price that you're offered. So that ownership model, the governance and the regulations in the country are really important to defining the cost effectiveness, obviously, as well as the technology choices that are fueling it.
Great, thank you. There's another question, like to what extent are social and behavioral barriers around households contributing to that? And are there good communication strategies that could help increase? Is that something for you, Chiara? Like increase the demand of framing? How should we communicate around heat pumps?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a very good question, and is also a very important point in the sense that this impact the consumers, but also let's say, all the workers in the value chain. For example, even if we think at plumbers, at the end they recommend consumers what to choose, and building confidence, having the right communication tools to share information that this technology works, this technology can work efficiently, how to install it is really quite key. In my opinion, for example, I didn't even manage to convince my parents to install a heat pump. They put a hybrid heat pump because the plumber said they needed the hybrid heat pumps in that contest. So I was like really impressed on how these communications challenges are impacting and can be really a barrier for some consumers. So it will come over time, but I think a proper awareness campaigns, proper communication and training at all levels can really play an important role, and maybe also support to the consumers, for example, through one-stop shops that now in Europe are becoming more and more common, and also regulation is coming for them, can really help to push the technology forward.
Yeah, thank you, Chiara. And we shouldn't blame people. It's like it's just we can't expect that everybody does like a whole lot of research before replacing a heating system. It's just the normal way should be to just ask your plumber and then get a proper response. And I believe, Vivian, you looked at that more closely, other barriers. And what's your policy recommendation on that? How can we help consumers?
Uda, this is another really great question. So I've heard in a couple of the presentations and some of these mentioned before, one of the primary consumer barriers to heat pumps is obviously cost, both the upfront and operating cost of systems, as well as the cost to install. It's also worth noting that low and moderate income communities are often disproportionately prevented from accessing the technology due to cost factors. I'll also add another barrier is to consumer heat pump adoption is a lack of technician familiarity, in some cases with heat pump systems and installations. Just as an anecdote, a member of our staff last year tried to have a certain type of heat pump installed in her home, and the technician that she called out wasn't familiar with it at all. They did try to locate it for her, but ultimately weren't familiar enough with the system to be able to perform an installation. So um, the solution to this, I think, I mentioned a couple of different types of policies, and I'll talk about those again. Minimum energy performance standards. I'll reiterate that standards for appliances drive energy and cost savings for consumers. They help to ensure that only the highest efficiency heat pumps enter the market, which can help to address the cost of household energy bills over the product's life cycle, which is really, really important. I also mentioned incentives. These can be structured in a variety of ways, including directed at the technician or installer or toward the consumer, and they can help address the upfront cost barrier and create motivation for techs to become more familiar with and recommend the equipment more frequently to their customers, which is a significant issue. So finally, I did briefly talk about clean heat standards. These often include provisions for an array of market incentives and programs aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The state of Vermont in the US recently implemented a clean heat standard that requires states to prioritize energy saving measures for customers with low and moderate incomes and households with high energy burdens. And that this has seemed to be really successful up to this point. So yeah, I think those are some of my key takeaways.
Great, and thanks for that great example from Vermont. Stefan, there's another question for you. Like the main cost coming between not clear. Some producers say, well, it's the installers that are the cost. Some installers say, well, the producers are the cost. What's the solution? Is there some way we could have more price transparency?
Yes, I think this would be an excellent first step. So first of all, kind of creating a price transparency for consumers to actually know how much a heat pump should cost and whether an installer is offering a reasonable price or not. But yeah, I think in the end, the key solution is a fundamental transition in the distribution of heat pumps and a more streamlined processes. We see some very interesting business models here. For example, Octopus is installing heat pumps in the UK, but also in Germany in a way more streamlined process. And we see other companies doing this as well. So this has a great potential to actually reduce energy costs, reduce the costs of installing a heat pump by quite a high factor. But yeah, in the end, as mentioned during my presentation, you would need kind of an incentive for these manufacturers to engage more in the distribution. So something like a clean heat market instrument, sorry to mention it again, would be very useful here because it would actually incentivize manufacturers to make things more attractive for consumers and therefore, get more engaged in the distribution of heat pumps.
Thank you so much, Stefan. And my feeling is kind of that everybody here on the panel has his or her preferred policy instrument, if I may say so. But my feeling is that you can all adhere to the heat pump toolkit and a more comprehensive framework, which we need in the end for affordable and clean heating. Thank you all so much for your insights. Our time is up, unfortunately, so we'll have to end the discussion.